excursion à travers les mondes détruits des animaux artefactuels, ou en anglais, a foray through the degraded or depleted worlds of artificial animals, fait... Alors, qu'est-ce qui c'est? Fait allusion évidemment au texte de Jacob von Uexküll, le Streifzüge durch die Umfelden von Tieren und Menschen, traduit d'habitude en français, excursion. En français, on dit d'habitude les mondes des animaux et des mondes humains. En effet, c'est un texte tout à fait différent, écrit 20 ans plus tôt. Mais le titre traduit littéralement excursion à travers les mondes des animaux et des humains. Okay, I'll switch then into English now. Excursion into the worlds, into the depleted worlds of artifactual animals. And here's my text on the screen then. In Jacob von Uexküll's essay from 1934, A Foray into the Worlds of Animals and Humans, worlds translate Umwelten, meaning environment, or milieu, and more specifically, a world structured and schematized by the physiological organs or tools of a given organism. Rightly recognized as one of the foundational texts of environmental research, the central preoccupation of Uexküll's foray was to reverse the mechanistic assumption that non-human living beings are clusters of what he called effect tools and perception tools, defined by the absence of a machine operator, which is to say, defined by the absence of a subject who uses these aids, who affects and perceives with them. Uexküll argued that every living being transforms the unstructured manifold of its surroundings into a readable, meaning-laden milieu, full of environmental cues, decipherable only to the techniques of the specific sense organs that organize that milieu. The individual creates its own world in this respect, adding a dimension of subjectivity that makes life about more than just survival and adaptation. The thrust of Uexküll's project is basically Kantian, grounded in the extension of Kant's transcendental subjectivity beyond the confines of a metaphysically privileged humanity. But we now know that that if there's anything distinct about the life of the human animal, it is precisely not that we stand over and above nature in a relation of unidirectional causality. All organisms exist in a state of so-called structural coupling with their milieus, both shaping their surroundings and being shaped by them. The neurons of the central nervous system translating changes in the environment into behavioral changes registered at the level of the organization of the brain. To quote from Maturana and Varela, the functioning organism, including its nervous system, selects the structural changes that permit it to continue operating, or it disintegrates. Without exception, though, the selections made by humans are made through the artifactual cultural tools with which we supplement our physiology. And what sets humans apart is not lesser but greater plasticity, which means that the instruments through which we carve out our milieu extérieur exert a more powerful reciprocal effect on our neuroplastic milieu intérieur. Subjects are created by the tools we operate to create our worlds, and technical objects function as the transcendental conditions of the sensory apparatuses that we use to build and interpret our creations. It need not even be us who are operating these tools for them to exert a determinant effect on the profoundly artificial animals that we, as products of our artifactual organs and environment, always already are. And this means that the diligently anti-humanist postmodern critique of the hubristic modern subject is only one end of a continuum that spreads from essentialism to vitiation. While once the big issue was our supposed excess of presumed agency, it's now rather our lack thereof. Now, in the seminal theory of life as autopoiesis or self-production, advanced by the Chileans Humberto Maturana and Francesco Varela, already cited above, one of the most evident features of a living being is its autonomy, which is to say the way it becomes distinct from its environment through its own dynamics, by specifying its own rules of behavior. Life, that is to say, can be measured by an organism's ability to differentiate itself from its milieu and transcend the forces acting on it. If so, then judged against this criterion, we might begin to wonder about the extent of current human life, about whether the blatant disregard with which we treat our natural, so-called natural environment stems from the excess of our subsumption under and our failure to escape determination by our technological milieus. The haunting spectre of the end of the world is as much about our failure to respond to ecological stimulus, the fact that we pay no attention to the current state of the environment for the most part. The haunting spectre of the end of the world is as much about our failure to respond to ecological stimulus and to participate in the construction of new world's alternative milieus as it is about the damage our building has already done. Uexküll sought to promote a vision of life as a polyphony of sensoria, of multiple forms engaged in the overlapping experience of multiple different worlds. Against this, however, we find ourselves now caught in a cycle of seeking out more destructively efficacious techniques in the pursuit of the very goal of avoiding environmental experience, avoiding the attentiveness to environmental cues that, for Uexküll and Maturana and Varela alike, become the basic axis of life. Some 30 years ago, in 1984, Neil Postman wrote of laughing ourselves to death, entertaining ourselves to the brink of extinction. That laughter is more half-hearted nowadays, with more than a hint of obligatory fun. For much of the post-68 phase of post-structuralism, if not since the end of the 19th century, the ironic affirmative joy of the Übermensch was praised for an unanchorable levity that promised to dispel the spirit of gravity of Kantian moral order. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari began their Anti-Oedipe with one such vision of joyous affirmation in the image of a chubby little boy grinning mesmerically as he hooks himself up to a vast technical social machine through the medium of an elaborate spinning stick and ball game. Je parle évidemment de Boy with Machine de Richard Lindner, qui est une des images principales discutées dans l'Anti-Oedipe de Deleuze et Guattari. Et c'est une image qu'il affirmait comme illustration parfaite de la vie machinique joyeuse. But that gesture of participation that we see in Boy with Machine, that gesture of participation in the techno-symbolic order, might nowadays look more like prostitution or prostitution, a consumption of us by sprawling technical systems that feed on rather than produce energy. The image that comes to mind here is of livestock numbed by painkillers and antibiotics, sucked dry by apparatuses whose labour extracts from, rather than works with, the organisms to which they're attached. Viewed from the standpoint of a present in which the technologies of consumerism leave us neuroticized and anaesthetized by the short-term buzz of the screen, the dark-eyed smile of Richard Lindner's Boy with Machine becomes the exhausted rictus of one who, gulping mindlessly at the latest piece of gadgetry, is sacrificed to the jouissance of artifactual monsters that rather enjoy at our expense. And in an all-too-familiar experience of being similarly wired but demotivated, depressed, infantilized and obese, we are at least consoled by the thought that the end of the world will make for good television. The idea that capitalism is alive and consuming us is far-fetched, but a tendency among economic commentators to push beyond metaphor and ascribe life as a fundamental emergent property of economic activity lends it a degree of credence. Although their language rarely crossed into biology in this particular set of pages, Deleuze and Guattari come close to depicting flows of capital as highly adaptive forms of non-organic, purely axiomatic life, able to feed on or commodify the most challenging environments. The economists Paul Ormerod and Paul Mason, if I can find the cursor, we've got these three books here. Paul Ormerod, one of the leading figures of chaos theory economics. Paul Mason, post-capitalist, friend of the accelerationists, I think, or at least he discusses you from time to time. And then the original cover for Émile Zola's Germinal. I'll come to that in a moment. The economists Paul Ormerod and Paul Mason show less linguistic restraint than Deleuze and Guattari, implicitly adopting a theory of life first sketched out by Maturana and Varela. Paul Ormerod describes society as a living organism which adapts and learns via self-maintaining autopoietic feedback systems that collapse the distinction between mechanics and biology. Paul Mason directly states that capitalism is an organism. It has a life cycle, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Neither Paul takes their biology quite as seriously as Émile Zola, whose monumental novel on the brutalities of 19th century mining, Germinal, conjures l'ogre insatiable du capital to read exploitation as a kind of nutrient-sapping metabolism, with labour and desire ingested by voracious industries happy to excrete the rest. The most extreme and perhaps also therefore the most problematic version of this claim comes most recently from Franco Berardi, Bifo, who posits the emergence of an info-networked superorganism evolving outside the sphere of human decision-making. Despite appearances, Zola at least is not simply indulging in a metaphorical borrowing of metabolism from biology. Heavily influenced by Claude Bernard, his novels are underpinned by an elaborate theory of the inorganic institutions of society being subject to the physico-chemical laws of organic life. Similarly, Ormerod and Mason are not so much metaphorizing as affirming that life is not restricted to the cellular organisms of the natural sciences, echoing the growing but far from unanimous acceptance of life not as a binary quality of genetic material, but as a spontaneously emerging property of complex, evolved systems. That was what Henri Atlan will say, for example. But that isn't to say that this invocation of living capital is uncomplicated. In Mason and Ormerod alike, the presence of what the American economist Paul Krugman once termed biobabble ou bioblabla en français serves an additional purpose for both economists here. Making the dubious point that life can be stimulated to grow but not ultimately planned and controlled, Ormerod's neoliberal hope is that governments will stop attempting to interfere with the organic functioning of the markets. Writing from the opposite end of the political spectrum in Post-Capitalism, A Guide to Our Future, by contrast, Paul Mason invokes the cycle of life to emphasize that capitalism can and will die. Capitalism is a complex adaptive system which has reached the limits of its capacity to adapt. But even as he argues for a much-needed alternative here, his invocation of natural selection risks repeating the established ideological trick of making the iniquitous behaviours of capital seem natural, ergo legitimate. In so doing, Mason elides the sense in which the tool-built environments of culture are characterised by a distinct mode of evolution, namely what Bernard will call artificial selection. Less immediately a question of new species of digital and capital life than the pursuit of life by means other than life, the extension of life into and by the non-organic. One of the most prominent figures and trenchant critics of post-2008 austerity economics, I'm sure you know, is the Greek economist and ex-Syriza finance minister Yanis Varoufakis. Varoufakis argues that the moribund economic order of global American neoliberalism is anything but vital. He's therefore a major critic from within economics of Darwinian or vitalist economics that attempts to conceive capital as a living entity. To quote here from Varoufakis' Global Minotaur, the Darwinian market-based process of weeding out the maladaptive or least efficient, of deregulating labour markets so as to force workers to adapt to the demands of a hyper-competitive economic climate, is not the natural spontaneous outcome of the self-organisation of capital as understood as an emergent form of technical life. Rather, the global minotaur as a living thing, which isn't really living, derives from a concerted, globally enforced industrial policy of building cutthroat artificial environments and forging tools like collateralised debt obligations, credit default swaps, junk bonds and payday loans to create demand where there is none, to construct a political and economic ecology capable of sustaining the pericardial heart of Wall Street. The pericardial heart of Wall Street. The waning of what Bernard Stiegler will describe as the 21st century libido thus spreads far beyond the bedroom to become symptomatic of a global crisis of desire at both micro and macroeconomic levels. And at the macroeconomic level, it can only be sustained by the fire sale of public assets, the continual printing of new money, and the equivalent of what Varoufakis calls cortisone injections that lessen the pain without ultimately curbing the death throes of finance-fueled consumer capitalism. Now, Varoufakis' critique of the ideological ruse of Darwinian economics converges with a Stieglerian strand of thought that refuses the conflation of life with a narrow construal of evolutionary adaptation. That line of thinking also links our current lack of vigour to a surfeit of adaptation, an excess of adaptation, to the channeling of human organisms into toxic environments to which we're required to adapt without being able to participate in constructing those environments ourselves. So here we see then a loss of what Uexküll describes as the participation of the organism in environment making. We are no longer in that position. It's in this respect that habitat loss has become an issue, not just for the native species of land given up for what Jason W. Moore terms cheap nature, but also for the deracinated labourers whose warehoused life of the mind is left stunted by the restriction of work to the labours of adaptation. This is the argument, too, of Paulo Virno, that work is primarily nowadays about adaptation to environments that are dislocated and unhealthy. And much of this thought of work of this kind is grounded in the Marxist biology of the evolutionary theorist Richard Dick Lewontin, who makes the point that all species, echoing Uexküll here, for Lewontin, all species participate in the construction of milieus in which they thrive. For Lewontin, adaptability comes to the fore only if we're deprived in our capacity to build our own environmental niches. This is the niche construction theory of evolution. First and foremost, organisms build their own environments. Genetic adaptation is only a factor if those habitats that we build get destroyed and we have to fall back on biological capacities. Artificial selection is an extension of this niche construction theory through which all nature is not simply there, but actively produced. And if contemporary living is marked by declining vitality, it's because, like the animals forced to make do with substantially depleted territory, we too are being closed off from the environment making that is constitutive of life in its supra-biological sense. Before they even exist, digital and capital life forms are being scapegoated for this loss, projected as the cause of the feeling that life is now elsewhere. And yet, really at the heart of this issue is the nature of contemporary work, which is to say work conceived purely in terms of adaptation, purely as a labour of productivity. While Varoufakis works at the level of macroeconomics, the gist of his argument about the need for cortisone suggestions to sustain the economy recurs also in microeconomic labour theory, currently negotiating the idea of needing to mainline life into dead labour. That phrase comes from a brilliant book by Carl Cederström and Peter Fleming here, Dead Man Working, the idea that most of us in work are zombies having the exact equivalent of pericardial sustenance to keep us going. If labour is dead in this respect, or at least mindless, it's because it's become decoupled from active decision-making and what Stiegler terms the invention of new possibilities of psychic and collective individuation, the transformation of concealed possibilities into new forms of life. The recognition of artificial selection as a distinct mode of selection must therefore be accompanied by the development of a concept of artifactual life that questions after more than the ontological status of computer viruses and robots. Artifactual life is much more than robots, it is us, and we need a theory of life that will encompass that. Above all, artifactual life pertains to we, the intermittently non-inhuman. And the issue here is that as with undiscovered life forms that we encounter only once they're already on the verge of disappearance, when deforestation exposes their habitats to the disease-ridden bearers of modern science, it's ironically only now when artificial life is threatened, when the invention of the human through techniques is critically endangered, it's only now that we're beginning to discover this need for flourishing human environments too. We'll move on to a concept that comes from the anthropologist David Graeber, who writes of les zones mortes de l'imagination. Je crois que le livre dont il s'agit ici, en anglais, The Utopia of Rules, a récemment été traduit en français, La bureaucratie, c'est ça? Okay. Writing on marketing techniques that prime the non-conscious choice, the intuitive decision without attention of hapless consumers, the American affect theorist Brian Massumi reports that influential studies have found a negative correlation between rational calculation and consumer satisfaction. In other words, consumers feel less bad about their decisions when actively encouraged not to reflect on them, when giving themselves over to what Massumi terms the doing done through me by technical infrastructures that program thought and decision on our behalf. These findings are reinforced by research into the market mechanisms surrounding the financial instruments deemed so heavily at fault in the crash of 2008. A report from 2009 compares the behaviours of derivative traders in New York and London to those of participants in the famous Milgram experiments, who mustered little resistance to the order given to turn up a dial and electrocute actors in an adjacent room. As the ex-chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, conceded at the time when testifying before the United States Congress, the technical complexity of credit default swaps and the impenetrable institutional apparatus surrounding their sale meant traders went along with policies that, had cause been more tangibly tied to consequence, they might otherwise have found more objectionable. In the absence of grasping the tools of the trade, the assumption that human input is rendered unhelpful and insignificant in the automated processes of derivatives exchange became a kind of consolation for those caught up in their deeply dubious sale. But that isn't to say that the automation of decision has granted financial workers lives of guilt and stress-free insouciance. The sector's problems of mental illness are legendary, with near 75% of city traders revealed by a 2014 survey in London to have symptoms of the stress that the Austro-Canadian endocrinologist Hans Selye, sorry, that's misspelt, once termed a disease of adaptation. And here's where we come back and we make the link between the economics of adaptation and the depletion of human environments. The diseases of adaptation, that's the medical description originally given to the concept of stress. The statistic of 75% of financial traders showing signs of mental ill health echoes a diagnosed crisis of mental ill health and white morbidity, la morbidité blanche, the latter attributed to increasing death rates from drug and alcohol poisonings, rising suicide levels, and chronic liver disease and cirrhosis, traced in turn to a rise in the pain caused by economic pressures. The growing prevalence of addiction that leads to cirrhosis of the liver doesn't just medicate this pain. There's a technique for ensuring adaptation to the dislocated environments of the contemporary workplace. Addiction facilitates a rational surrender to technologies that think and feel on our behalf. Franco Berardi will even read the rise of addictogenic pornographic habits as a similar attempt at emotional automation, a desire to have feelings and affects numbed and taken away from us. Our body does the thinking on our behalves when it gets automated by pornography. At its heart, therefore, the diagnosed stress pandemic marks the point where the impossible demands of high-level decision-making become indistinguishable from not making decisions at all. Much has been written on the functional stupidity of a work culture that rewards those who precisely do not think, but merely feign to do so and succeed because they internalize and reproduce the positive affirmation of institutional norms. And one such norm sees office presenteeism take centre stage in the committed performance of one's indispensability to downsizing and precarious industries. In the semiotics of David Graeber's bullshit workplace, the automation of behaviour short-circuits decision. Being at work substitutes for meaningful labour, or rather, in the language of Stiegler's La Société Automatique, labouring substitutes for the meaningful value creation of work. And it does so at a price, which is to say, the psychic infarctions, the depression, exhaustion, and other neuronal illnesses caused by the structural violence of the pressure to perform in the contemporary workplace. To ward off the spectre of madness, et c'est ici que je touche aux quelques thèmes dans la disparition, to ward off the spectre of madness, the burnt-out soul turns to doping technologies like pills, porn, and alcohol to reinforce the diminishing place of the self in what Gregory Bateson described as the much larger trial and error system of environmental feedback, comprising the extension of mind into the object through which we do our thinking, acting, and deciding. First written in 1943 and revised in 1966, Georges Canguilhem's Le Normal et le Pathologique did much to pave the way for subsequent work by Stiegler on the construction through tools of our external and internal milieu. And it can function in our present discussion to conceptualize the mental ill health caused by the very attempt to eliminate what Jacques Derrida described as the agonizing madness of the decision. Canguilhem argued that health and illness are both relative to a localized norm, with the former consisting in a marge de tolérance pour les infidélités du milieu, a margin of tolerance for the inconsistencies in an environment, or the ability of an organism to withstand environmental change. This was Canguilhem's measure of health. Disease, then, for Canguilhem, amounts to a kind of decline in the ability to withstand environmental change, une réduction de la marge de tolérance des infidélités du milieu, which he also termed a loss of adaptability. Now, we need to make a key distinction here between adaptability and adaptation. For Canguilhem, adaptability is not mere adaptation or submission to a fixed setting. which is to say not the kind of specialization that is perfectly suited to one stable environment, but thereby threatened with catastrophe as soon as that environment changes. Rather, Canguilhem's adaptability signifies independence from the constraints of fluctuations in an organism's habitat. And it's linked in turn to the organism's ability to generate new modes of life by structuring its own environment. In the case of Bernard Stiegler's intermittently non-inhuman animals, health would thus involve far more than our capacity to endure and adapt to a given situation. It becomes bound up with our ability to channel energy through tools into environmental transformation and thereby escape the kind of toxic environment in which every minor variation threatens to be experienced as catastrophic. Writing at much the same time as Canguilhem, Cette observed that stress can facilitate the transformative process. But there also comes a point when the demands of adaptability become too great and stress tips from cure into poison, in the language of pharmacology. Insofar as it runs counter to entropy and death, adaptability can designate aliveness, but adaptation energy, or what following Bernard we might call libido, eventually, according to Cette, this aliveness or adaptation energy eventually runs out. Its amount is finite, and its exhaustion coincides with the diseases of adaptation typified in the stress-related symptoms of physiological and psychological burnout. Now, Cette was writing before the growth of the so-called paradigm of depression described by Elisabeth Roudinescu. But we can fill the gaps through reference to what Catherine Malabou describes as the new wounded, les nouveaux blessés. For Malabou, the nouveaux blessés describes those who, the category of the neurologically ill, incorporating those whose neuroplastic propensity to adjust to circumstance is exploited to the point where plasticity becomes explosive, culminating in nervous breakdown, to say nothing of suicide, suicide being up 60% over the last 2 generations. A capitalist ideology that treats plasticity as a byword for unlimited flexibility is the principal culprit in Malabou's analyses. Its excessive demands leading to emotional indifference and a devastating collapse in our capacity to be affected by our environments. In other words, we go back to this idea that life for Uexküll, for Maturana and Varela, sits the capacity to respond to environmental cues, environmental signals. And nowadays, the very symptom of our increasingly hostile, dislocated environments is that we've become desensitized, unable to respond to the cues issued by these environments. We've become emotionally indifferent and numbed, desensitized to our environments. Ironically, then, the very neurodiversity that enables us to respond to the multiple environmental challenges and in cues is eroded by the increasingly narrow parameters of our workplace milieu. Our neuroplastic ability to learn from experience by rewiring the connections in the brain is eroded by the twofold destruction of the kinds of habitats from which we can learn. First, by the engineering of hostile conditions of the workplace, and second, through the medications to which we recourse in a bid to stem corrosive feedback loops that stem from our internalization of these restrictive milieu. The absurdity of the predicament is captured in the ubiquity of Ritalin, or methylphenidate, a cocaine-like psychoactive prescribed to some 6 million Americans and just under 1 million people in the UK, mostly distractible, attention-deficient school-aged males. And we give them Ritalin with the aim of proving their levels of work focus. The drug is intended to augment our adaptability to the constructed surroundings of understimulating schools within the context of a hyper-stimulating wider culture. And yet the one proven effect of consuming Ritalin is exactly a decreased capacity for neuronal plasticity in the brain region, which is critical for learning and memory. The very drug that is intended to help us learn from experience has been shown precisely to inhibit our capacity to absorb environmental information. A technology designed to enhance plasticity ultimately has the very opposite effect. David Graeber's concept of dead zones of the imagination, referring to the intellectually moribund atmosphere of the average office, comes into play here. Graeber maps post-1970s economic stagnation and the dwindling of the technological imagination onto the proliferation of bureaucratic technologies that homogenize work around an interminable cycle of semi-automated administration and routinized drudgery. The narrowing of stimulus is not without consequence for the neuroplastic brain. We know from neuroscience that the continual stimulation of the same synaptic pathways has the effect of weakening the alternative neural colonies that constitute points of reference, points of resistance to the multiple demands on our attention. So-called attentional narrowing involves the pruning of neurons no longer deemed necessary as the brain over-adapts to its surroundings. And it's further magnified when imagination-inhibiting dead zones push us to intoxication, to drug consumption as a means of escape. The workplace, once we resort to addiction, to alcohol, to drugs as a way of forcing our own adaptation to hostile workplaces, the workplace becomes inseparable from the cravings for dopamine and the hits of dopamine through which we retreat into an alternative zone of addiction and oblivion, while the descent into addiction accelerates the vicious cycle of attentional narrowing and neuronal pruning. The narrower our environments, the more the prefrontal cortex molds to fit, and the lesser our margins of tolerance for absorbing change without pharmacological fortification. We enter into a vicious circle of ever-depleting environments and our ever-decreasing capacity to tolerate these environments. But the solution is not to abstain, be it from work or any other form of intoxication, since this actually hastens what neuroscientists call ego fatigue or ego depletion. Self-privation and the interminable anxious self-commentary at occasions on the part of the addict ultimately just increase the impulse to consume and thereby reinforce the dominant pathways around which the consciousness of the addict gets reorganized. If agency is to be gained, by contrast, if agency is rather to be created, it can only come about through the creation of new habits, new habitats of experiential learning, which strengthen the aspects of synaptic selfhood lest bound up in patterns and habits of addiction. Living better than just surviving becomes a matter of abandoning the tools of adaptation and adopting others more apt to build an alternative future and an expanded form of neurodiversity. Alors, je peux continuer pendant encore 5 minutes ou je peux m'arrêter là? Okay. At the risk of posing a somewhat trite question and of preaching to the converted, one might ask the question of what role there is for the university and philosophy in particular in this notion of better living and augmented neurodiversity. The perhaps surprising answer is that universities and the humanities in particular, and philosophy above all, have a long history as therapies for society-wide crises of addiction and automation. A long history of responding over and above endlessly invoked crises of the humanities to crises in the ecology of being human, which coincide with every paradigm shift in the technical systems that constitute our artifactual environments. At the time of the fall of Athens, it was philosophy in the Platonic Academy that carved an escape route from a society run ragged by automation, first of the nervous system, then of the law. Greek oral culture had been held together by mnemotechniques displaced or automated through the advent of the written word. When the ensuing loss of social cohesion tipped into a cultural contagion of weakness of the will, Plato harnessed the tools of reason, grounded in the abstract logic of formalized grammar, to develop new anthropotechniques of self-discipline. The same pattern is repeated in the Enlightenment, when the clockwork technologies of Vaucanson's human-like automata spill over into disruptive industrial automation. When the combination of mass production, liberated time, and social dislocation saw disordered addictive consumption rise for everything from gin to books. There are 18th century, 19th century diagnoses of both book addiction and a much more celebrated gin addiction, certainly in London and Ireland. When we have these diagnoses of automation-related addiction, Immanuel Kant envisaged a university adequate for industrial society's division around specialized labor. At the heart of this new organization of society around the automation and specialization of labor, at the heart of that society stood Kantian critical philosophy, and more generally the philological humanities, which were envisaged as serving to cultivate our capacity for freedom in the face of increasingly heteronomous forces of causality. That pattern is repeating itself now when, as then, the very disciplines that appear most endangered by our unfurling predicament could, with a little tweaking, provide a combative antidote, not just to their own threatened extinction, the threatened extinction of philosophy and the humanities, but rather these reworked, these disciplines could provide the antidote to an entire civilizational malaise. This is the project of philosophy reconstrued as digital studies, a critical discourse on technology that seeks to develop the tools required to overturn the pacifying effect of stimulation overload and kickstart our depleted capacity for environment making. Je m'arrête là. Merci.